Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and let's try using some of the worst creatures ever printed in the Commander format, but not in a silly, goofy way. We're going to actually use them to our advantage. One of the things I love about the Commander format is we can take some of these old cards that were essentially laughed at when they first came out, and now we can maybe actually make a good deck with them. So for example, Eater of Days, 4 mana, artifact creature, Leviathan, 9/8 flying trample, which is an incredible rate even by today's standards. However, when it enters the battlefield, you skip your next 2 turns. That is horrendously bad. And even in the Commander format, obviously a 9/8 flying trample creature is really good, but in the Commander format, skipping your next 2 turns is basically just conceding the game, right? If you had this guy enter the battlefield, first of all, there's 0 chance it's actually going to be around when you get back to your next turn, but also the game might even be over by the time you get around to your next turn, right? However, we are going to try to make a deck where this will actually work. Leveler is another one, right? 5 mana artifact creature, Juggernaut, 10/10, so a 5 mana 10/10. Again, that's an incredible rate, but when it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards from your library, which this actually sees play in the Commander format, funny enough, because people do use this in concert with those Thassa's Oracle type of effects. It actually can help you win the game. But in this situation, of course, we're not doing that. We just want a creature that is typically going to be really, really bad, but we're going to make it really, really good. Now, I will point out, this is not going to be like a Beamtown Bullies deck. A lot of people will say, hey, use Beamtown Bullies and do that. And of course, in that deck, what you would do is put creatures with like really bad downsides to donate to your opponents, right? That strategy is not what we're doing here. We actually want to use these creatures ourselves. And so for that reason, the creature has to have an upside. It has to be good, other than that horrid drawback. So Sky Swallower is another great one. 3 blue Leviathan, 8/8 with flying. So this is an 8/8 flying creature for 5 mana, which again, even in the Commander format, that's pretty damn good. But when it enters the battlefield, target opponent gains control of all other permanents you control. Oh boy. Again, even though an 8/8 flyer is pretty good, you're pretty much conceding the game if you donate all your permanents to your opponent. Bold Weir Heavyweights, 2 red giant warrior, 8/8 with trample. Again, so an 8/8 trampling creature for 4 mana, pretty great. But when it enters the battlefield, each opponent may search their library for a creature card and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle. Hoo boy. So again, 8/8 trample creature good. The upside you're giving to all your opponents, though, is pretty horrendous. Now, some people might notice that all of these creatures, the downside is an enter the battlefield effect, or I guess we just call it enters now. And that's the strategy we're going with, right? All of these creatures are essentially just really great creatures with horrible ETBs, which of course we can shut off with a Torpor Orb effect. 2 mana artifact creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. Now, as it happens, it's also going to hurt our opponents, right? That's sort of the added bonus of this strategy is my opponent's got Eternal Witness. Well, that ain't going to do nothing, right? My opponent's got a Ravenous Chupacabra. That's now a 4 mana 2/2 creature that doesn't do anything else. So there is an advantage here as well. What colors are you going to build this deck? Well, the color I think it has to be is white, because just like white doing a whole lot of other things great in the format, one thing white does pretty much no other color can do, I guess, other than Torpor Orb, right? The Hushwing Griff effect. Hushwing Griff being the first creature that they did this with. 2 and a white Hippogriff 2/1 has flash, so you can flash this out in response if you want to. Also has flying, and creatures entering don't cause abilities to trigger, right? This is that Torpor Orb effect that we're looking for. Again, this card was typically used to hate on your opponent's creatures entering the battlefield. That's just an added bonus here. We're using this to our advantage. So now if I have my Hushwing Griff in play and I play my Eater of Days, of course, creatures entering the battlefield don't trigger abilities, which means the Eater of Days skip your next 2 turn abilities will not trigger. So now we're just getting a 4 mana 9/8 flying trample creature. That's pretty darn good. How about Phyrexian Dreadnought? There's a 1 mana 12/12 trample creature that essentially has no other downsides if one of our Torpor Orb or Hushwing Griff effects is in play. That's incredible, right? Typically, when it enters the battlefield, you'd have to sacrifice any number of creatures with total power 12 or greater. But in this deck, you're not going to have to worry about that. You're just getting an incredible rate for this creature. And this strategy is very doable now because they keep printing more of these effects, right? Hushbringer, 1 and a white fairy, 1/2 flying and lifelink. Creatures entering the battlefield or dying don't cause abilities to trigger. Strict Proctor, 1 and a white, Spirit Cleric, 1/3 with flying. Whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to trigger, counter that ability, unless its controller pays 2. So of course, we're just gonna forgo paying the 2 here, obviously, and that ability will be countered. It won't actually happen. Tocatli Honor Guard, 1 and a white, human soldier, 1/3. Creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger, right? There's a lot of these effects, of course, in white, so this deck does definitely have to be white. Doorkeeper Thrall, one that just came out in Murders of Karlov Manor, 1 and a white, Thrall, 1/2, flash flying. Artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. Again, now it's the power creep thing here. We got creatures that are even cheaper than they were before, and they also have added abilities as well. This is just a strictly better version of Hushwing Gryff and is including artifacts as well as the creatures. And again, maybe we're actually going to be shutting off our opponent's strategies. That's an added bonus of what we're doing here. I will recommend, though, throw Stifle effects in your deck, okay? So maybe now we're also playing blue. If we're playing blue, Stifle effects are going to be great here because, of course, we can screw ourselves. We can be casting our Sky Swallower, and in response to it entering the battlefield, our opponents will blast our Hushwing Gryff or our Torpor Orb or whatever our shut-off effect is. They can just kill it in response to us casting that creature. So now what do? Now we're in the situation where our Sky Swallower is on the stack, our Hushwing Gryff has been killed, and as soon as our Sky Swallower enters the battlefield, we got to donate all our stuff. So again, basically game over for us. A Stifle effect will also work here, right? The Sky Swallower enters the battlefield, and we just respond to the trigger by stifling it, and it will be countered. So throwing a few effects like that in the deck is going to be a nice backup as well. So now I guess maybe we're in a white-blue deck here, and if we're in the blue version of this deck, Wormfang Manta is going to be a great addition. And again, just a terrible creature, I think, throughout the history of the game, but we can get into some shenanigans here, right? Again, if we're shutting off ETBs, this guy gets a lot better. So 5 blue Nightmare Fish Beast 6/1. That's an interesting creature type. Has flying, so it's a flying fish. 7 mana 6/1 flyer, of course, is horrendously bad. Even when this card first came out, I remember thinking, man, 7 mana for a 6/1 flyer, that's terrible. When it enters the battlefield, you skip your next turn. So again, there's the shutoff part, right? We don't have to worry about that downside. And then also, there's an upside. When it leaves the battlefield, you take an extra turn after this one. So if we have our Hushwing Gryff in play, now this guy becomes not only not so horrible, but kind of an upside. 7 mana for a 6/1 flyer that when it leaves the battlefield, you get an extra turn. That gets a lot better, right? That actually seems like a pretty good rate. And also, you can get into some shenanigans here, right? Obviously, if you start blinking this guy, you can take infinite turns, and this is something else you can do in the deck. So if I have a Mist Meadow Witch, for example, I can pay 2 white and a blue, exile target creature, return the card to the battlefield under owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So of course, if I have my Wormfang Manta in play, I've already shut off the ETBs, right? Or I guess now we're just going to call it the E's because there is no more TB. But when I blink it, of course, it's going to leave play, and I'm going to get an extra turn after this one. It's going to come back on my end step. Don't have to worry about skipping a turn because, of course, I have my Hushwing Gryff in play. And obviously, I can just repeat the process every single turn, and essentially, I'm going to win the game. So again, anyone looking for the win con for this deck? I mean, obviously, the win con for this deck is just I smash people with my giant creatures. An 8/8 flyer or an 8/8 trampler is pretty darn good even in the commander format. That's how you're going to win with this deck. Now, which colors are you going with? I would say white is absolutely necessary here. Blue is probably my second bet for just obviously the creatures that you can put in here. There's a lot of good blue ones like Wormfang Manta and Sky Swallower. Also, though, I like the Stifle effects in this strategy. That's a great thing to add in addition to what you're already doing, kind of like a backup. Also, again, Stifle just works in any deck. You can use it to stifle your opponent's Aetherflux Reservoir if the opportunity arises. Outside of that, you could just do a blue-white version of this deck. You could throw in some green, maybe you could throw in red, whichever is your preference. What's the commander you're going to use? Certainly, this is a Method 2 deck where I'm building around the idea first, and I'm going to add in a commander that maybe fits or maybe doesn't. I guess if your commander doesn't fit at all, it would be a Method 3 deck because you're just looking for the colors. You certainly could go with a Bant version of this deck, and if you did so, you could use, say, Ruin of the Hidden Realm as your commander, which, of course, will work with the Wormfang Manta combo. So now I don't need the Mist Meadow Witch. One of my combos combo pieces is in the command zone. It's whatever you decide depending on the colors you want to be using. It's a really fun deck idea, I think. I have a patron with this deck. It's really neat to see it work in person. All these funny, old, janky, silly creatures with these horrible downsides that you can put in the deck that not only are they now playable, but they're also pretty darn good, in my opinion, right? Once you shut off those horrible ETBs. That's the strategy of the deck. I'm shutting off the ETBs of my creatures to make them better. Go down the rabbit hole, find some of those creatures with horrible downsides. Again, they don't really do that anymore. Creatures don't really have drawbacks anymore. It's all upside. So you'd have to go down the rabbit hole to find some of these old creatures that have really bad downsides that you can shut off. Has to be an ETB though, right? That's what we're fitting into this deck. Run with the idea yourself if you want to, and let me know if you're already doing this. Maybe some of you guys out there already have a deck that's doing something like this. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.